The radar screen flickered, then it locked. Somewhere in the Pentagon's dimly lit operations center, analysts' coffee went cold as they stared at the signature. An Iranian drone, 8,000 feet above the Arabian Sea, wasn't just flying, it was hunting, circling the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group like a predator studying its prey, mapping every radar frequency, recording every defensive position, probing for weaknesses in the most powerful naval asset the United States Navy deploys anywhere on Earth. This wasn't a training exercise gone astray or a navigation error. This was deliberate. This was reconnaissance with purpose. And it happened at precisely the moment when Chinese destroyers, bristling with missiles and Russian warships flying the naval ensign, were conducting their largest joint military operation with Iran in waters that carry 21% of the world's oil supply. If you think that timing was accidental, you haven't been paying attention to how modern warfare actually works. What unfolded in those waters between January 27th and February 1st, 2026, represents something far more significant than another routine Middle East crisis or predictable posturing between adversaries. This is the visible emergence of a new global military architecture, a coordinated challenge to American naval dominance that has been building beneath the surface for years and is now broken into plain view. The pieces have been moving into position quietly, incrementally, but now they're locked in place and the game has fundamentally changed. We're watching the birth of something that doesn't have a name yet, something that looks like an alliance, functions like an alliance, but operates without the formal treaty structures that define 20th century geopolitics. And if you're not concerned about what this means for global stability, for energy security, for the balance of power that has prevented major war between great powers for 8 decades, then you need to look closer at what's actually happening in the waters surrounding Iran. Let's strip away the diplomatic language, the carefully worded press releases, the sanitized military briefings, and examine the raw facts of what's taking place. The exercise, officially designated Maritime Security Belt 8, brings together naval forces from Iran, China, and Russia in the northern Indian Ocean, the Gulf of Oman, and the approaches to the Strait of Hormuz. That narrow passage, buried 21 miles wide at its choke point, represents the world's most critical petroleum transit route. Close it for a week, and global oil prices don't just spike, they explode. Close it for a month, and you're looking at economic disruption that cascades through every industry dependent on affordable energy, which is essentially every industry that exists. The strategic importance cannot be overstated, and everyone involved in these exercises knows it. China didn't send patrol boats or token gestures to this operation. They deployed Type 055 guided missile destroyers, the most advanced surface combatants in the People's Liberation Army Navy arsenal. These vessels represent the cutting edge of Chinese naval technology. Massive warships displacing over 12,000 tons, equipped with 112 vertical launch cells, capable of firing everything from anti-ship cruise missiles to long-range surface-to-air missiles to land attack weapons. Their integrated radar and combat systems rival, and in some aspects exceed the capabilities of American Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. These are blue water warships designed for sustained operations far from Chinese shores, power projection platforms built to challenge American carrier strike groups, not coastal defense vessels meant to patrol territorial waters. Alongside these behemoths came Type 052D destroyers, slightly smaller but equally sophisticated, each one a networked node in China's expanding vision of naval presence across the Indo-Pacific, and now, evidently, into the Indian Ocean and Persian Gulf. The message embedded in this deployment is unmistakable. China can operate advanced military forces thousands of miles from its coast. China can coordinate complex naval operations with partners in regions where American dominance has been assumed since World War II ended. China has both the capability and the political will to establish naval presence in waters that control the energy resources Beijing depends on for its economic survival. This isn't about defending Chinese territory. This is about defending Chinese interests, wherever those interests extend. And those interests now demonstrably extend to the approaches of the Strait of Hormuz. Russia's participation adds layers of complexity that transform this from a bilateral China-Iran relationship into something approaching a tripartite coordination mechanism. Russian Defense Minister Andrei Belousov spoke with unusual directness when addressing cooperation between Moscow and Beijing regarding developments in Iran and Venezuela. He stated explicitly that these situations require constant analysis and corresponding actions, taken jointly by Russia and China. Parse that language carefully. Constant analysis means ongoing intelligence sharing, continuous monitoring, real-time assessment of developments. Corresponding actions means coordinated military and diplomatic responses, synchronized policies, joint decision-making. This is alliance language without the formal alliance structure, partnership that functions operationally even while maintaining plausible deniability about treaty commitments. Russian naval assets participating in Maritime Security Belt 8 are aren't as numerous or as modern as China's contribution, reflecting Russia's focus on its land war in Ukraine and the constraints that conflict imposes on Moscow's ability to project naval power globally. But Russian presence matters politically and strategically, even if the whole count is modest. It signals to Iran that resistance to American pressure is backed not by one great power, but by two. It signals to the United States that military action against Iran potentially brings complications with both Beijing and Moscow. It signals to regional powers throughout the Middle East that the days of unchallenged American freedom of action might be ending. But here's where the story becomes more complicated and potentially more concerning than simple naval exercises and diplomatic coordination. Intelligence reporting, confirmed through multiple sources, documents repeated flights by Russian Il-76 military transport aircraft from Russia and Belarus into Iran. These massive cargo planes, roughly equivalent to the American C-17 globemastering capability, represent serious logistics muscle. They're not courier aircraft delivering documents or small equipment packages. They're designed to carry tanks, armored vehicles, artillery pieces, helicopters, and the full spectrum of heavy military equipment that defines modern mechanized warfare. Analysts have specifically identified Mi-28 attack helicopters arriving in Iran aboard these transports. The Mi-28, known to NATO as the Havoc, is a sophisticated gunship designed to hunt armored vehicles and provide devastating close air support. It carries anti-tank guided missiles, unguided rocket pods, and a 30mm cannon capable of destroying light armored vehicles in fortified positions. This is frontline combat hardware, not defensive systems or training equipment. Alongside the helicopters came Spartak armored vehicles, Russian-made infantry fighting vehicles that provide protected mobility and fire support for ground troops. So when the question gets asked, are there Russian troops in Iran? The answer requires precision and context. Are there Russian brigade combat teams, 5,000 soldier formations, with their full complement of armor and artillery, establishing permanent bases on Iranian soil? What we're seeing instead appears to be equipment transfers accompanied by technical advisors, training personnel, and potentially small specialized units necessary to facilitate the integration of sophisticated weapon systems into Iranian military structures. That distinction might sound semantic, but it matters enormously. Equipment transfers with technical support represent deepening military cooperation and capability enhancement. Full-scale troop deployments would represent something categorically different, a level of commitment that would fundamentally alter regional security calculations and potentially trigger responses from the United States and its regional partners. Defense analysts who study Russian military capabilities and commitments have noted that imagining large-scale Russian ground troop deployments to Iran strains credibility. Russia's ground forces are heavily committed in Ukraine, burning through equipment faster than peacetime production can replace it, and facing manpower constraints that have forced multiple rounds of mobilization. Moscow doesn't have spare mechanized divisions sitting idle waiting for expeditionary missions to the Middle East. What Russia can provide, and what appears to be the actual policy, is advanced weaponry, technical expertise in operating and maintaining that weaponry, air defense systems that make Iranian airspace more dangerous for potential attackers, and the kind of intelligence sharing and military-to-military cooperation that enhances Iranian capabilities without requiring Russian forces to fight Iranian battles. China's strategic calculus differs from Russia's, but aligns in crucial ways. Beijing isn't particularly interested in Iranian territorial defense or regime survival for ideological reasons. China's interests in Iran are ruthlessly pragmatic, centered on energy security, belt and road infrastructure investments, and the broader objective of reducing American influence in regions China considers essential to its economic future. Iran supplies substantial oil volumes to China, transactions increasingly conducted outside traditional Western financial systems, using Chinese yuan or barter arrangements that bypass dollar-denominated markets and the sanctions architecture Washington has constructed. These energy flows matter existentially to Chinese economic planning. Any disruption, any threat to their continuity, represents a direct challenge to Chinese interests that Beijing has demonstrated willingness to protect. The naval exercises aren't preparation for Chinese forces to invade someone or defend Iranian territory from American ground assault. They serve multiple overlapping purposes, all strategic in nature. First, they demonstrate that China can project meaningful naval power into the Indian Ocean and Persian Gulf regions, areas where Chinese presence has historically been minimal. Second, they protect sea lanes that carry the oil China's economy depends on, establishing Chinese naval capability to defend those routes if necessary. Third, they signal to both regional actors and global powers that China operates militarily in coordination with partners who share its interest in challenging American hegemony. Fourth, and perhaps most important from a military development perspective, they provide invaluable operational experience, allowing Chinese crews and commanders to practice extended deployments, complex coordination with foreign navies, and operations in unfamiliar waters far from support infrastructure. Every operational cycle builds institutional knowledge that makes Chinese naval forces more capable and more confident operating globally. This is how great powers are built, through incremental capability development, dozent in real-world conditions, replicated in training areas or simulators. The People's Liberation Army Navy is teaching itself to become a true blue water navy, doing so in waters have dominated since the crystallized situation in ways that strategic discussions about great power competition sometimes obscure. The unmanned aircraft that appeared on tracking systems on January 27th and 28th, 2026, operating at altitudes between 8,000 and 12,000 feet in the Arabian Sea, wasn't some hobbyist quadcopter or jury-rigged civilian system. Based on flight characteristics, altitude capability, and operational profile, this was almost certainly a military-grade reconnaissance platform, likely Mohajer 6 or possibly The implications of this drone as presence near the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group extend far beyond simple surveillance. First, it demonstrates that Iranian intelligence networks successfully tracked and located one of the most powerful naval assets the United States deploys. Aircraft carriers are massive, over 1,000 feet long, displacing 100,000 tons, accompanied by cruisers and destroyers that add to the radar signature. They're not subtle. But knowing generally where a carrier strike group operates and having precise enough location data to dispatch a surveillance drone requires functioning intelligence systems, satellite access or other overhead reconnaissance, and processing capability to turn raw data into actionable targeting information. Second, and more significantly, the drone's operation was visible. Military reconnaissance platforms can operate in ways that minimize detection, can avoid flight paths that civilian tracking networks monitor, can employ electronic warfare techniques that make them harder to spot. The fact that this drone showed up on publicly accessible flight tracking websites means Iran chose to make this surveillance visible. This wasn't purely intelligence gathering. This was theater, demonstration, messaging. Iran was announcing to the United States, to regional observers, to global audiences, that Iranian assets are watching American naval movements, that Iranian capabilities extend hundreds of miles from Iranian shores, and that Iran possesses both the technology and the willingness to monitor and potentially target U.S. naval forces. The timing, occurring simultaneously with the Maritime Security Belt exercise involving Chinese and Russian warships, cannot be coincidental. This was coordinated signaling, multiple actors demonstrating capabilities and resolve in synchronized fashion. While Chinese destroyers and Russian vessels conducted exercise operations in the Gulf of Oman, Iranian drones circled American carriers in adjacent waters. The messages: integration, coordination, mutual support. Attack one element and you potentially trigger responses from the others, not necessarily through formal treaty obligations, but through shared interest in preventing the precedent that military action against any member of this loose coalition succeeds without consequence. This brings us to a development that has received insufficient attention despite its profound implications for naval warfare in confined waters. Iran has deployed its first dedicated drone carrier, a vessel named Shahid Bagheri after a Revolutionary Guard commander, to the Persian Gulf near the Strait of Hormuz. Let that capability sink in for a moment. A ship specifically designed and outfitted to carry, launch, recover, maintain, and rearm unmanned aerial vehicles. Intelligence assessments suggest this vessel can accommodate up to 60 drones of various types and configurations, from small reconnaissance quadcopters to medium-altitude long-endurance platforms, to loitering munitions, essentially flying bombs that can hover over target areas waiting for engagement opportunities. The strategic implications of concentrating 60 drones on a single mobile platform are genuinely concerning for anyone tasked with naval air defense. Traditional defensive systems, sophisticated as they are, were designed around different threat models. They're optimized to intercept a limited number of high-value targets: cruise missiles, manned aircraft, ballistic missiles. They perform significantly less effectively against drone swarms, large numbers of small, relatively inexpensive unmanned vehicles attacking simultaneously from multiple vectors. The mathematics of defense become brutal. Each advanced surface-to-air missile costs between $1 and $3 million. Each drone it intercepts might cost $50,000, maybe less for simpler designs. Launch 60 drones at a defended target, and you force impossible choices. Engage every threat and exhaust your missile inventory defending against cheap, expendable platforms. Ignore some threats and accept that some will penetrate defenses. Defense analysts studying drone warfare, particularly lessons from Ukraine where both sides employ unmanned systems extensively, have concluded that swarm attacks represent one of the most challenging problems in modern air defense. You can't simply scale up existing systems because the economics don't work. You can't afford to fire $1-million interceptors at $10,000 targets indefinitely. Alternative solutions exist: directed energy weapons like high-powered lasers or microwave systems, electronic warfare that jams drone communications and navigation, gun-based close-in weapon systems, but none of these have been deployed at scale on naval platforms. tested thoroughly in combat conditions or proven reliable against sophisticated adversary tactics. Iranian military doctrine has evolved considerably over the past 2 decades, shaped fundamentally by recognition that Iran cannot match American or coalition forces in conventional symmetrical warfare. You cannot outbuild the United States Navy when America spends more on defense annually than the next 10 countries combined. You cannot field a more capable Air Force than the U.S. Air Force when American pilots train more hours, fly more advanced aircraft, and operate within the most sophisticated command and control networks ever developed. What you can do, what Iran has systematically done, is develop asymmetric capabilities that exploit vulnerabilities, that turn opponent strengths into potential weaknesses, that make conventional military superiority less decisive. Drone swarms represent one element of this asymmetric approach. Fast attack boats carrying anti-ship missiles represent another. Small craft that can swarm from multiple directions, fire salvos that saturate defenses, then scatter before retaliation arrives. Coastal missile batteries hidden in prepared positions represent a third element. Anti-ship missiles that can engage targets throughout the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz from positions difficult to locate and neutralize. Naval mines represent perhaps the oldest asymmetric weapon, but remain effective, capable of closing waterways or forcing traffic into kill zones. Cyber capabilities targeting ship systems, navigation, or communication represent the newest element. Attack vectors that don't require kinetic weapons at all. This isn't a strategy designed to defeat the U.S. Navy in open ocean fleet engagement. That scenario is beyond Iranian capabilities, and likely always will be. This is a strategy of denial and cost imposition. The objective isn't winning a naval battle. The objective is making any naval battle so costly, so complicated, so risky, that the political will required to initiate combat erodes before the first shot is fired. It's about creating enough uncertainty, enough danger, enough potential for disasters like a sunk American destroyer or a carrier damaged by swarm attack, that decision makers in Washington conclude that military options against Iran carry unacceptable risks. The timing of all these developments, the joint exercise, the drone surveillance, the equipment deliveries from Russia, exists within a broader geopolitical context that makes each element more significant. The Trump administration returned to power explicitly promising confrontational policies toward Iran, maximum pressure through sanctions, rhetorical escalation that questions Iranian regime legitimacy, support for Israeli military actions that target Iranian proxies and occasionally Iranian forces directly. From Tehran's perspective, this isn't normal great power competition. This is existential threat, regime survival under question, national sovereignty challenged. In that context, deepening military cooperation with Russia and China isn't aggressive expansion or revolutionary export. It's defensive necessity, building deterrence, creating enough complication and risk that military options against Iran become unpalatable, even to the most hawkish American policymakers. China and Russia, for their parts, see opportunity in Iranian insecurity. Every weapon system Iran purchases from China represents revenue for Chinese defense industries, creates long-term maintenance and upgrade dependencies that ensure ongoing relationships, and demonstrates Chinese weapons effectiveness in ways that support export sales to other countries. Every Russian military transport flight into Iran delivers equipment that deepens Moscow's influence, creates technical dependencies that give Russia leverage in future negotiations, and builds personal relationships between Iranian and Russian military personnel that facilitate intelligence sharing and cooperation across multiple domains. Both Beijing and Moscow benefit from keeping the United States strategically engaged, stretched across multiple theaters, forced to maintain readiness for contingencies in Europe, the Middle East, and the Pacific simultaneously. An unstable Middle East, an Iranian threat that requires constant monitoring, planning, and force posture maintenance, absorbs American military attention and resources that might otherwise focus entirely on containing Chinese ambitions in the South China Sea, or countering Russian revanchism in Eastern Europe. It's strategic manipulation at the highest level, using regional crises and conflicts to shape adversary decision-making and resource allocation. The strategic competition unfolding in waters surrounding Iran isn't fundamentally about Iran, not really. Iran is the arena, the geographical space where larger contests play out, but the real stakes involve global order, the structure of international politics, whether the system remains organized around American military and economic dominance, or evolves into something multipolar, where regional powers backed by great power patrons can effectively challenge U.S. preferences in their neighborhoods. The naval exercises in the Gulf of Oman are proof of concept. Can China operate sophisticated naval forces thousands of miles from home waters? Can Russia coordinate complex military operations despite being heavily committed in Ukraine? Can Iran serve as an effective hub for anti-American coalition building? The answers emerging from these operations suggest yes, at least partially, and that reality challenges assumptions that have underpinned American strategic planning for decades. American naval supremacy has been a foundational element of global security architecture since 1945. The ability to project overwhelming power anywhere on Earth's oceans, to guarantee freedom of navigation for commercial shipping, to protect allies through naval presence, to punish adversaries through carrier strike groups that can appear off hostile coasts and launch devastating airstrikes. All of this has been assumed, taken for granted, built into every calculation about how international politics functions. Challenge that supremacy, even incrementally, even in specific regional waters, and you begin unraveling assumptions that underpin trillions of dollars in global trade, decades of alliance commitments, and the security guarantees that have prevented major war between great powers since nuclear weapons made such conflicts unthinkable. What makes this moment particularly dangerous, more dangerous perhaps than any military development in isolation, is the absence of effective crisis management mechanisms and communication channels. During the Cold War, despite profound ideological hostility and multiple incidents that brought the world frighteningly close to nuclear exchange, the United States and Soviet Union developed sophisticated systems for managing military encounters, for ensuring that tactical incidents didn't spiral into strategic catastrophes. The hotline between Moscow and Washington, the Incidents at Sea Agreement that governed naval encounters, the nuclear notification protocols, all represented recognition that great power competition needed guardrails, that the stakes of miscalculation were too high to allow accidents or misunderstandings to drive escalation. Those guardrails are largely absent in current U.S.-China relations and severely degraded in U.S.-Russia relations. When an Iranian drone circles an American carrier strike group while Chinese destroyers and Russian warships conduct exercises in adjacent waters, who's talking to whom? Who's ensuring that a nervous watch officer does not interpret a radar contact as hostile intent and initiate an engagement sequence that triggers responses nobody actually wanted? What protocols exist for managing close encounters between warships operating in confined waters where misunderstandings about intentions can escalate in seconds? The technical capabilities of modern weapon systems have advanced dramatically, while the diplomatic infrastructure designed to prevent their catastrophic misuse has atrophied. Iranian drone technology specifically represents a fascinating case study in innovation under constraint and the proliferation risks that successful indigenous development creates. International sanctions and deliberate isolation forced Iran to develop domestic capabilities rather than simply importing from established defense exporters. The result has been a surprisingly sophisticated unmanned systems industry that now exports products to Russian forces fighting in Ukraine, to Houthi rebels conducting attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea, to various militant groups throughout the Middle East and beyond. Iranian-designed drones have appeared on battlefields from Syria to Sudan, demonstrating both their combat effectiveness and the difficulty of controlling proliferation once capabilities exist. The technological evolution has been rapid. Early Iranian drones were crude, easily intercepted, limited in range and payload capacity, essentially glorified model airplanes with cameras attached. Current generation systems feature satellite communication that allows control beyond line of sight, sophisticated guidance systems including GPS and inertial navigation, modular payload bays that can accommodate different sensor or weapons packages, and critically production processes that enable rapid manufacturing at scale. These aren't cutting edge compared to American MQ-9 Reaper or Chinese Winglong drones, but they don't need to be cutting edge. They need to be effective enough, affordable enough, and numerous enough to change tactical calculations, and they clearly meet those criteria. The Shahed 136, a loitering munition that Russia has employed extensively against Ukrainian infrastructure, exemplifies this philosophy. It's simple in design, essentially a flying bomb with a motor, but devastatingly effective when used in large numbers against targets with limited air defense coverage. Production costs reportedly run around $20,000 per unit, maybe less with economies of scale. Ukraine has had to allocate sophisticated air defense systems, missiles costing hundreds of thousands of dollars each, to intercept these relatively primitive weapons, because the alternative, allowing them to strike power infrastructure or command facilities, is unacceptable. The presence of these capabilities, concentrated in and around the Strait of Hormuz, creates permanent tension and persistent crisis potential. Every tanker transiting those waters, every naval vessel, every commercial ship, operates under theoretical threat of drone surveillance and potential attack. That uncertainty, that persistent low-level threat, imposes real costs even when nothing actually happens. Insurance premiums for ships transiting the region increase. Naval escorts become necessary for commercial traffic deemed high value. Alternative routes, longer and significantly more expensive, start looking attractive despite the added cost. The mere capability, properly demonstrated and publicized, achieves strategic effects without requiring actual attacks. So where does all of this leave us? What pattern emerges when you step back from individual incidents, specific equipment transfers, particular exercises, and examine the broader strategic trajectory. We're witnessing the construction of a counter-hegemonic coalition, not formalized through treaty structures or alliance proclamations, but coordinated through overlapping interests and complementary capabilities. Iran provides geographic position, regional expertise and influence, asymmetric warfare capabilities developed through necessity. Russia provides advanced weaponry, technical expertise in operating sophisticated systems, air defense capabilities that make attacking Iran more dangerous, and great power diplomatic cover. China provides economic resources, naval presence that can protect sea lanes vital to Chinese energy security, and the long-term strategic commitment that comes from existential dependence on Middle Eastern oil. This coalition doesn't need to defeat the United States militarily in any conventional sense. It doesn't need to match American capabilities system for system or platform for platform. It needs to create enough complexity, impose enough costs, generate enough risk that American freedom of action becomes constrained. Every drone that requires tracking, every naval exercise that requires monitoring, every military transport flight that needs assessment, every capability development that demands contingency planning absorbs finite resources and limited attention spans. It's deterrence through complication, death by 1,000 cuts, constraint through accumulated friction points rather than single decisive confrontations. The fundamental question facing American strategists and policymakers isn't whether to respond to these developments. The United States is already responding, positioning carrier strike groups, increasing surveillance flights, strengthening security partnerships with Gulf Arab states, conducting freedom of navigation operations, preparing military options for various contingencies. The question is whether these responses address the underlying strategic shift or merely react to surface-level symptoms, whether they're adequate to the challenge, and whether any diplomatic pathway exists that could reduce tensions without appearing to reward coalition building against American interests. Because here's the deeply uncomfortable truth that rarely gets stated plainly in public discourse. The United States cannot be everywhere simultaneously, cannot monitor everything continuously, cannot respond to every provocation immediately, cannot maintain absolute dominance across every maritime domain while also maintaining readiness for conflict with China in the Pacific and deterring Russian aggression in Europe. Physics, budgets, political will all impose constraints that adversaries understand and exploit. For decades, American strategic advantage derived partly from the fact that potential adversaries couldn't effectively coordinate, couldn't operate far from their shores, couldn't challenge American presence without accepting catastrophic risk to their own security. Those conditions are eroding steadily, not eliminated entirely, not reversed completely, but degrading in ways that accumulate and compound over time. The Iranian drone circling the USS Abraham Lincoln wasn't just gathering intelligence on ship movements and defensive systems. It was testing response protocols, documenting reaction times, probing for gaps in coverage and weaknesses in procedures. That information flows to Iranian military planners, gets shared with Russian and Chinese counterparts through the intelligence relationships these exercises facilitate, informs future operations and tactical developments. Every encounter generates data that makes subsequent encounters less uncertain and potentially more dangerous. The story that began with a radar signature over the Arabian Sea at 0347 hours on January 27, 2026, isn't really about one drone or one naval exercise. It's about power, security, deterrence, alliance formation, and the fundamental question of who sets rules in which spaces. These questions lack simple answers, and the situations unfolding in waters between Iran, Oman, and the Arabian Peninsula won't resolve cleanly or quickly. They'll evolve, escalate periodically, occasionally de-escalate, but persist as permanent features of international politics for years ahead. Understanding what's actually happening, separating verified facts from speculation, recognizing both genuine concerns and exaggerated fears, that's essential for anyone trying to comprehend a world where old certainties no longer apply, and new arrangements have not yet crystallized into stable patterns.